All right, let's talk about dating. But forget all the self-help books and articles about finding the one. Today, we're going to crack open the data and see what's really going on in the modern American dating game.
If you've ever felt like the rules for dating and relationships have just been completely rewritten, you are definitely not alone. It's a feeling a lot of us have, and it turns out the data actually backs it up. So let's dig into why finding a partner today feels like a whole different world than it was for, say, our parents.
Okay, so let's dive right in. To really get a handle on the modern dating scene, we first have to look at a huge shift in the American social landscape. And it all starts with a pretty simple question. Who's married and who isn't?
Let's rewind the clock to 1978. Back then, a solid 59% of young adults, we're talking people between 18 and 34, were married. For that generation, that was pretty much the norm.
But fast forward to today, and wow, that number has absolutely plummeted to just 25%. That is a massive drop, and it completely reshapes what early adulthood even looks like for millions of people.
So, with people marrying later in life and divorce being more common, the result is pretty simple. The dating phase of our lives is just longer. We're spending way more years navigating the single world, which makes understanding that world more important than ever.
Okay, so if more of us are single for longer, how are we all meeting? Well, this is where the story takes a major turn because the answer has completely flipped on its head in just the last couple of decades.
Think about this for a second. In 1995, friends were the #1 matchmaker. That's how most people met. But by 2017, according to some amazing Stanford research, online dating had become the #1 way heterosexual couples meet, blowing past friends, family, and coworkers. In less than a single generation, technology became the main matchmaker.
But here's a little twist in the story. Even with all these new apps and websites, not everyone is actually looking to date. Data from the American Perspective Survey shows this really significant gender gap. Just over half of young single men say they're open to dating, but for young single women, that number is only about a third. So for the people who are on the market, what are they actually looking for? This is where the data reveals some, let's just say, fascinating, and some pretty stark differences between men and women. A speed dating experiment from Columbia University kind of cut right to the chase. When they looked at people's actual choices, not what they said they wanted, but who they actually pursued, they found that men consistently put more weight on physical attractiveness, while women placed a higher value on intelligence. And get this, that same study uncovered this really powerful detail. When a woman's intelligence or ambition was seen as being higher than a man's, his interest actually went down. For men in that study, a partner being more ambitious was a significant negative. Okay, so beyond that initial attraction, what about the big deal breakers? Well, some things are pretty much universal. Almost everyone agrees on smoking. But you can see some clear gender divides in other areas. For example, 81% of women would be less likely to date someone who's unemployed. For men, that's only 56%. It kind of signals that old expectation for the man to be a provider is still lingering. And this isn't just numbers. This quote from a woman in a survey really brings the data to life. She talks about this disconnect, this feeling that some men are looking for a type of woman that just doesn't really exist anymore, A woman who, as she says, wants to go to college and have a career. So let's say you've matched, you've gotten past the deal breaker test. What happens next? What actually shapes the connection itself? And what kind of relationships are Americans even looking for these days? So psychology gives us this really powerful way to think about this called attachment styles. It's basically the blueprint for how we connect with people. And a recent poll found that only 38% of Americans identify with what's called the secure style, which is the one that's most linked to stable, healthy relationships. That means the majority of us fall into other categories, like anxious or avoidant. So what does secure even mean? Well, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's being comfortable with emotional closeness, being able to trust and rely on people, and being able to communicate what you need. And why does this matter? Well, the data shows this style is strongly correlated with being in a successful, long-term relationship. Now, when we look at the kind of relationships people want, the data gets really surprising. While, yeah, a majority of Americans, 55%, still seek complete monogamy as their ideal, a really significant 1/3 of people are open to some form of non-monogamy. That's a huge chunk.
But, and this is a big but, there's a huge gap between what people might want for themselves and what society thinks is okay. This table shows what's called the net approval score. It's basically the percentage of people who approve minus those who disapprove. And look at that. Monogamy has a massive plus 72 score. But things like open relationships and polyamory are way down in negative territory. So even as personal interest grows, they're still not really accepted by society at large.
So after all of that, after navigating the algorithms, the checklists, the different attachment styles and relationship models, what do Americans actually agree on? What are the timeless keys to a successful partnership? Well, it turns out, despite all the modern complications, the answers are surprisingly simple and timeless. Huge majorities of people all point to the absolute basics: trust, honesty, respect, communication, and friendship. At the end of the day, this is the bedrock, and it doesn't matter how you met. And that brings us back to a key finding from that Stanford research we talked about. How you meet someone doesn't predict if you'll succeed as a couple. Whether you swiped right or got set up by your aunt, the relationship pretty quickly takes on a life of its own. In the end, it's about what you build together. That's what really matters. Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on. We've seen how technology and big social changes have totally transformed the dating landscape. But what the data seems to suggest is that, in the end, maybe the foundations of a lasting connection are far simpler and more timeless than the complicated game we all now play to find it.